Good morning. Is this turned on? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Well, welcome to Research Days 2014. It's one of my favorite events, and I'm glad to see so many students and faculty in the audience. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our visionary leader, President Farahi, to give some opening remarks.
Good morning. You're not awake yet, are you? Yeah, most of you will try to show up later, right? Welcome again. This year we have 164 posters. That's the largest number ever. So thank you for the students and the faculty who mentored you to get here today. I just want to say a couple of things and then let the process continue. The number one thing is that in today's world, students without research capabilities would have a much lower chance of success than those who have that capability. The future, or in mostly fields that require research, that require the joy of discovery, that require the ability to find new solutions to the old problems. And some of the things that I read in the book, I haven't finished it yet because it's so heavy and so large, are amazing. Just the thought of at this level and at this stage of your education being able to think about those complex problems makes us very happy. The only way a university can succeed in the 21st century is for our students to be way ahead of what they can get with online systems and through a regular four-year institution. This university is dedicated to applied research, and with your help, we will get there and we will succeed. Just in this building, we're doing things that nobody has done before in New Jersey, and we will do more of it. So congratulations for your success. And thank you for putting all the hard work into the program and into your research. And I'd love to see all the components later on today and then tomorrow. So thank you very much and enjoy the day. Thanks.
Thank you, President Farahi. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Rachel Louise Snyder. She's a writer and a radio commentator. She has a very distinguished career, so I'm just going to give you some highlights. She's the author of a best-selling book called Fugitive Denim, and Library Journal named it one of the best business books of 2007. An excerpt of the book, Dreams of Distant Factories, aired on public radio's This American Life and was awarded the 2006 Lowell Thomas Award from the Overseas Press Club. Fugitive Denim was also featured on more than 24 public radio programs across the U.S., including the Leonard Lopate Show. After 9/11, Snyder covered the war in Afghanistan and the future of Afghan women by spending her entire time camped out with the women held at the Kabul jail. And in 2001, she was nominated for General Excellence by the Society of Professional Journalists. She also covered Aceh, Indonesia in the weeks and months after the 2004 tsunami. Her print work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Slate, Salon, Washington Post, Huffington Post, Chicago Tribune, New Republic, Red Book, and Glamour, if that weren't enough. Her second book, set in Oak Park, Illinois, entitled What We've Lost in Nothing, was published in 2014 by Scribner. She's hosted the nationally acclaimed Global Affairs series Latitudes on public radio, and she's also a contributor to public radio's Marketplace and All Things Considered. Currently, she holds a joint appointment in the Graduate Journalism and Creative Writing programs at American University in Washington, D.C. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Rachel.
I love those introductions. You know, they're only the highlights. It's a 20-year career, right? And so really a career is like this. right? But when you hear someone like that introduced, you only get the mountains, right? But I know all the peaks. I'll give you one little example, because there's a lot of people here from, I think, a lot of different disciplines, and this is a special thing. I don't find this at universities where they have this sort of cross-disciplinary connection, and I hope you can appreciate it because it's unique. It took me 14 years to get into the New Yorker. 14 years. That's a lot of valleys. And people get hung up on the number as if that's the important part of that story. Right? I'd have gone to year 15 or 16, 20, year 20. So, thank you for that very kind introduction in which only the highlights of my life are noted. And thank you all for being here so early in the morning. I know it's early to college students, so. This is a beautiful building, incidentally. I walked in and was instantly impressed with what you've done here. So, when I first was asked to speak at Research Days, I thought, are they all just going to come watch me do research? You know, I do research like in the Kabul prison for women. You're welcome to come with me. You have to bring your own lunch, though. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my first book, which came out of 6 years of living in Cambodia. I moved back to America 5 years ago now. So technically, the longest I've ever lived anywhere as an adult was Phnom Penh, Cambodia. I'll surpass that in about a year and a half. So, and so with this book, I had gone to Cambodia really knowing almost nothing about the country. I knew there was a genocide. That seemed bad, you know, but it was a long time ago. And I knew there was a really nice temple complex up in the north, Angkor Wat. That was all I knew of Cambodia. A lot of people don't even know that much, right? When I got there, I was shocked to learn that it was the world's first sweatshop-free developing country. I thought, how is this possible? How can they do this in this country? And no one knew about it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And let me get my notes down here. It's early for me too, still. So I want to start actually just by a quick show of hands asking how many of you are wearing jeans today? So like maybe about half of you. So I chose jeans not because I have any kind of affinity for denim, actually, but because they have, I think, a powerful cultural history attached to them, particularly for Americans. And so from a writing standpoint, that seemed sort of rich metaphorically. And so I use jeans, but I'm using them very loosely. It can apply really almost to any commodity that is produced in the global marketplace today. So we're going to talk a little bit about how I think about globalization, which is essentially in three parts: labor conditions, environmental conditions, and then us. These are the three categories I think about. Anyway, so woven throughout this talk is going to be an ethical conundrum that was presented to me. Is anybody, incidentally, a journalism major in here? All right, well, if you have friends who are journalism majors, tell them this story, because I have yet to encounter anyone who has given me any kind of idea about what they would do in this situation, which is heartening, actually, because I'm glad I'm not alone in my, I don't know what to do. But it was a situation that was presented to me after my first book came out and right before I left Cambodia. And so that story is going to be sort of woven throughout. So even if you've read my book, you won't know this part of the story. So let me just talk a little bit about Cambodia as a case study. And this gets at part one, the labor conditions, if you're taking notes. This, incidentally, is not a garment factory in Cambodia. It'd be lovely if they all looked like this. But this is just the National Museum. It's just a beautiful building. So Cambodia really had zero manufacturing in the mid-'90s. They were still recovering from the war. They had essentially no global industry at all. I think they relied largely on corruption, but that's off the record, of course. So they were one of, by the time they got into global manufacturing, they were one of 50 or 60 countries around the world that were in apparel manufacturing. And they had negotiated a deal under the Clinton administration in the mid-90s to essentially build their industry sweatshop free in exchange for access to the U.S. markets. That was more or less the deal. So their industry in 1995 had about 10 factories, and within 10 years, they had over 300. So it was a wild success, and they did it through a variety. I'm going to show you a slide later that actually has a website you can go to if you're interested in knowing more about how they did it. But essentially, they got local NGOs, non-governmental organizations involved in partnership with brands like the Gap and Levi's and Disney and H&M and Marks and Spencer, lots and lots of different brands, and the local government. And all three of those participatory actors got together and said, okay, how are we going to monitor these factories? How are we going to make sure they're sweatshop free? What are our conditions going to be? What are our labor laws going to be? I should preface this by saying that the labor laws, incidentally, in Cambodia only are enforced with garment workers. So the police officers, teachers, none of them enjoy the kinds of rights that garment workers do. So they get, for example, just to give you an example, 43 paid vacation days a year. 40. That's a lot. When you get out into the workplace, you're going to want to go live in Cambodia, I tell you, because you're not going to get 43 paid vacation days, unless you're a professor. They also get, if they're women, and of course most of them are, they get breastfeeding breaks twice a day. How many of you can tell me whether or not the U.S. has paid maternity leave, federally mandated maternity leave? Do we? No, we do not. In Cambodia, they do, though. 3 months, federally mandated paid maternity leave. Ours is federally mandated, but it's not paid. That's the difference. They also, in factories where there are more than 50 workers, which is most of them actually, they have to have one clinic medical bed for every 50 workers. They also are supposed to have preschools or nursery, daycare centers in their factories. A lot of them do not, actually. This is where they falter a bit, because in Cambodia you would never leave your child with strangers. You would leave your child with family. But the labor laws in Cambodia are built on French labor laws. So the French put that in there because, of course, that's what they do in their culture. That's what we do in our culture. But they would never do that in Cambodia. That would be a mark of great shame, in fact, to do that. It's an interesting little detail because it gets at the difference in cultures, right? What is normal for one culture, you don't even think about what is normal in your own culture. You're not even aware of it being a facet of your own culture. So Cambodia was wildly successful, right? Again, they have peaks and valleys too still today. I mean, there are issues all the time that come up in Cambodia. It's not a perfect system, but they've done pretty well, and so they decided they wanted to join the WTO. Well, the WTO wouldn't allow them to have this trade deal with the U.S. anymore, right? That would be unfair trade access that they would get that other countries would not get. Around the same time that they wanted to join the WTO was revamping a 6-decade-old system of global trade, essentially trying to even out the playing field, and so no country would have a sort of trade access that other countries wouldn't. And this became a big issue in Cambodia because the question was, would they survive if they didn't have that trade deal? Would they survive if they had to pay higher tariffs? Would they survive if they had to compete with China, which of course is nearby to Cambodia? And so this is right at the time that I moved there. And I realized this story has great tentacles far beyond this one little country that nobody's thinking about, right? This story says something about us. If Cambodia fails, it says something about us. And so I began to follow this story, and this is in part what I did for this American life. So we'll come back to Cambodia in a minute. I want to show you actually a factory in Cambodia and talk a little bit about some of the more complicated issues that they face. So this is a Levi's factory called PPS in Cambodia. And, there's a couple of things you can notice right away. I went there without any warning, right? I just showed up at the gate and I called. Normally you can't do that, but because I lived there and I spoke the language, I had access. I'd been covering this story for over a year, so people knew me. Some white American woman comes in speaking Khmer, people hear of you very quickly. And so everyone in the industry knew who I was. And so I was able to go in and out of factories very easily. And so the reason that that's relevant is that, a lot of factories, if they know a journalist is coming, they'll quickly turn on all their lights and clean everything up and make it all nice and fancy, right? So that never happened in my case because I never gave anyone advance warning. In Cambodia, China was a different story. I'll get to that later. So anyway, so, you can see, for example, that the lights are on. This is a big deal. A lot of times they're trying to save on electricity, so the lights are off. Cambodian electricity is 4 times what we pay here in this country. My husband and I, when we lived there regularly, had $600 a month electricity bills in a 2-bedroom apartment. Yeah, the rent was cheap, but the electricity could kill you. So could the internet, incidentally, which was about $400 a month. If you have a plan to go live cheaply in a developing country, you might want to look at things like that. So PPS, so the lights are all on, and the air is actually fairly clear. One of the big problems in factories is the filtration systems, right? And they have all this cotton floating around, and it gets in the lungs of workers, and it can kill them. So I'm a terrible photographer, you can see right now from this picture, but and it looks clearer on my screen than it does up here on the slide. But anyway, so this is actually a pretty decent factory of about 750 workers. And so I asked the manager of this factory what it was like for him operating in this system. He spoke English. His name is Vorn Van, and so he talked to me a little bit about this. I'm going to play a quick clip.
Just to give you an example, if the cost of electricity that I'm paying every month is about $6,000. Now, if I do not bother about compliance, I will switch off the lights and my workers can sew in a dimmer light. Yeah, I can save maybe 20%. Yeah, and that's a lot of money. And you're just talking about electricity. How about drinking water? If I don't give my workers proper drinking water, I can save $600 every month. If I employ, for example, kids under 16, I don't even have to give them anything. I just have to give them a bowl of rice and they will work for me.
One of the things that makes Cambodia more expensive than a place like China, for example, is that they have none of what they call their own inputs. So they don't make zippers, they don't make buttons, they don't grow cotton, they don't weave cotton into cloth, they don't dye the cloth. All they do is get these giant bundles of pre-cut fabric and a pattern, and they sew it together. So this makes them more expensive. China and India are like one-stop shopping, right? They grow the cotton right there, they mill it, they weave it into cloth. So there's significant competition for even things like making boxes for your clothes or making tags for your clothes. None of that happens in Cambodia. Everything is imported, and so that's one of their great challenges. You couldn't grow cotton there. In fact, it's too humid everywhere. This is public transportation in Cambodia. I just like this picture. Garment workers on their way home from work. But the country is not a panacea, as I mentioned before. There may be something very curious if you look at this picture. Do you notice, for example, there's a lot of empty stations? But what about off to your left? People are just working away, right? So let me tell you what this means. This is one of my favorite things about the Cambodian industry that is really in its infancy still. So the labor law in Cambodia allows you to form a union with as few as 3 people. So when I left in 2009, they had about 300 factories and more than 700 labor unions. Some of those unions are legit and professional, and many, many, many of them are not. And they don't have a history of arbitration, right? They don't know that when you are disgruntled, these are the steps that you go through. So oftentimes, depending on the union, workers would be disgruntled and they would immediately strike while the other half of the factory is just working away at their post because their labor union was not striking. And they would strike sometimes over really important things, like they're not getting bathroom breaks or they weren't paid for overtime. Like those are serious infractions. Sometimes they would strike over small things, like a group of workers didn't like the way one of their managers spoke to them. Or, this was my favorite story, a factory wasn't doing well and they had to lay off a group of workers. So they laid them off and they paid them severance. Well, when the workers who didn't get laid off heard about that severance, they went on strike to be laid off so that they also could get severance. And then, of course, they wanted to be rehired by the factory. That was I got to sit in on the arbitration of that one. That was a lot of fun. So this is one of the problems. Like, this is one of those kinks that they're still working out, right? The valleys that they're working through. And some of this is just cultural. So anyway, this is a great picture, and I don't think you have a sense of what it really means until you listen to me talk about it. So I want to get to this ethical dilemma. For anyone who's interested more in the Cambodian model, there's a website you can go to, betterfactories.org, and you can actually see, for example, what factories had what infractions and what they've done to fix it or not fix it. Anyone who exports from Cambodia is supposed to be on this website. And this is now being used as a model for other countries around the world. Vietnam is using it as a model. Bangladesh, we'll talk later a little bit about the factory that collapsed last year in Bangladesh. There's other countries. Jordan, which has had some serious sweatshop issues in the last decade, is now using this as a model. So there are a few around the world that are looking to Cambodia. So the ethical dilemma that I alluded to earlier came to me just as I was leaving in May of 2009. I had a friend who worked for a non-governmental organization doing education for kids. And as is true of many developing countries around the world, women are the primary caretakers of children, right? I mean, it's true here too, probably still today. But in developing countries, oftentimes when a woman is prosecuted for a crime, and I saw this in Afghanistan, I saw this in Cambodia, and she has children, what do you think happens to those children? Maybe they go to other family, but very, very often they go to prison right along with her. So when I sat for a month in that Kabul prison for women, I was in there with a bunch of kids, right? So this friend of mine came to me and said she had been trying to develop an education program for kids in the Phnom Penh women's prison, which, of course I was like, wait, what? There are children in the Phnom Penh prison? How come I didn't know this now in this month when I'm leaving Cambodia after all these years? And she said, well, the amazing part is that they are sewing for one of the big warehouses, one of the big factories. They're sewing outside in the open air under the trees. And they were being paid 10,000 riel a month. That's Khmer money. That's U.S. money, sorry. That's $2.50 a month. So subcontracting is one of the big no-nos. Why is subcontracting a big no-no in an age of factory monitoring and sweatshop-free industry? Because you can't monitor subcontractors, right? So it's really one of the biggest, most significant infractions. She didn't know what factory they were sewing for because that factory is smart enough to keep their labels off. So even the women didn't know who they were sewing for. They were sewing pink fleece sweatshirts, but they didn't know the brand and they didn't know the factory. So I said, this is blatant exploitation. This country is supposed to be sweatshop free. I've got to write about this. She said, I know, that's why I'm telling you. So I said, go talk to those women and I'll come in as an NGO worker. I kind of look like one, right? We're all kind of the same demographic. And I said, I'll go in with you next week and talk to them. She said, yeah, absolutely. So she came back the next week. I mean, I was ready to postpone my move back to America and everything. Like, this was a huge story to me. And she said, the women don't want to talk to you. And I said, are you kidding me? Like, it's blatant exploitation. Don't they know? She said, of course they know. But if they're not out there sewing, then they're in their cells for 23 hours a day with their kids. So at least their kids get to play. So as a journalist, you know, what do? What would you do? Do you tell their story anyway? Because you know it's against international law. It's against, you know, these donors are giving money to Cambodia because they've created this great system. On the other hand, you know, I'm a mom. Would I want my daughter 23 hours a day in one little room with me? She's great and all, but that's a lot of time. So I don't think I had been presented with that kind of ethical challenge in my career ever up until that point. As it turned out, that was preparation for another bigger one that I'll speak about some other time. But so I really didn't know what to do. I really had no idea. And I could have gone in anyway. I still could have gone in undercover, right, as an NGO worker. I could have deceived the women in that sense. That's a little ethically suspect, too, from a journalistic standpoint. But, you know, all those things would have been acceptable avenues. So as it turned out, I didn't do that. I went and I talked to someone I thought would know better. So I'm going to play another clip of what I did.
I'm Dan Henkel, Senior Vice President of Global Responsibility for Gap Inc.
That's who I talked to. I knew Dan would know. Gap was...
We have about 35 factories in Cambodia.
Oh, sorry.
Our factories run... I'm Dan Henkel, Senior Vice President of Global Responsibility for...
Dan. Sorry. We have a little sound issue. So Dan Henkel, Senior Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility. Gap has about 40 factories in Cambodia. They employ about 10% of the workforce there. They were not, incidentally, he went and looked and made sure that they didn't have pink fleece sweatshirts on their season that year. I think he got a little worried when I called him. So I presented him with the dilemma, and this was his first response.
Yeah, so with codes of conduct, if you look at all the codes that are out there, I don't think I've ever seen a code that doesn't have a prohibition on forced labor or prison labor. And I would say it's considered really one of the most significant violations of a code because it truly is a situation where you could have people working who really don't have sufficient protection and don't have the voice that you oftentimes need to ensure that working conditions are reasonable.
So I asked him, of course.
Even though they want the work.
Absolutely. It's the same argument that oftentimes we'll hear that in many countries we'll hear a factory management team say, but the workers really want to work a lot of overtime because they want to make as much money as they can, and so they can send more money home to their families and so on and so forth.
So I asked him, okay, this is a huge infraction, but, and this is what he said. I'm not going to give you his solution yet, but this was his first response.
Anytime you take an action, anytime a company takes any sort of action, whether it's stopping work altogether with a factory or cutting orders, you need to think about the consequences of those actions, right?
So what do we know? We know that it has to be stopped. We know that if this were Gap Inc., it would have to be stopped. But we also know that they're going to think about the consequences of stopping it. We'll get back to Dan in a minute. I want to move on to the next the next part of my talk, which is really about environmental. Well, I'm going to touch on chemicals just a little bit later because I feel like to leave those out of the conversation is leaving out an important piece of global manufacturing. But the thing I want to do now is I want you to look at the person's label sitting next to you and just tell me some of the countries that you see on those labels. You can just yell them out. Vietnam. All right. I love Vietnam. Huh? Philippines. Sri Lanka. Oh, that's that's unusual. Korea. Honduras. What? China, U.S. Taiwan. Anybody have more than one country? Wait, nobody said China, by the way. What are the chances of that? Oh, you said China. Okay. Anybody have more than one country on the label? Yeah? What is it? Yeah, on one label. Nobody? So this is interesting. Your labels are really lying to you, I got to tell you. Because your labels are suggesting that shirt, I imagine you all looked at shirts. I don't want to make any assumptions, but they're suggesting a single story, right? They're suggesting that garment is from that one place. Well, I have to tell you, I went to Guangzhou, China, to a Gap factory. And this was a pristine factory. I mean, you could have eaten off the floor in this factory. And I didn't go looking for sweatshops when I was doing this book because everybody knew about sweatshops already. I would say to someone, I'm writing about, global manufacturing, and they would say, oh, the sweatshops. And I would say, no, because you already know about them. So I went purposely in search of alternatives to sweatshops, right? I went looking for what else existed besides the sweatshops. So here I am in this pristine factory in China, and I had taken the train up from Hong Kong. And the only reason that's relevant is that you have to actually have a visa, a journalist visa for China, even though Hong Kong is part of China, right? So I go through the train, I get my stamp entering China, I go through this factory, I spend a whole day with a compliance vendor or factory auditor named Jerry, and we're standing in one of the main sewing rooms, and it's a Gap factory, and they're making blue and white striped shirts, men's shirts, and I suddenly look at the label, and the label says, made in Hong Kong. And I said to Jerry, my passport says that I'm standing in China right now. Like, China is not absent on our garment labels, right? Like, we see it all the time. Why would this particular label say made in Hong Kong? And he said, oh, that's good. And I was like, Jerry, I didn't quite catch that answer. Can you tell me that again? And he said, well, that's the... He wouldn't answer that question. Later, I found out why he wouldn't answer that question. And the reason is this. China, this is going to blow your mind, China feels held back by the world. Honestly, they feel like they could do, I know, right? Really? They feel like they could do so much more. They feel like they could manufacture so much more. But they feel like trade rules are prohibiting their growth. I heard this all over China. And so what they do, and they're not alone in this, by the way, lots and lots of countries do this. What they do is they know, for example, that the place that you make the most money are with complicated things like cuffs and buttons and collars, right? I mean, those are more complicated than socks or sewing the front and back panels of a shirt. So they send their pre-cut clothes out to, I don't know, Philippines or Indonesia, somewhere close by. And those factories do the easy stuff, right? The front and back of the shirt, maybe the cuffs, and then they send it back up to China, and China does the finishing. So China doesn't do the bulk of the shirt. They do the most complicated part, right? But because they haven't done the bulk, the label shows that it was made in the Philippines or made in Indonesia. And that way China still gets a cut. These are called there's an attempt to right the wrongs of this practice in a sort of complicated trade negotiation called rules of origin, right? And so the reason I asked if any of you had more than one country on your shirt is that oftentimes you'll see with newer garments, you'll see something like woven in the Philippines, assembled in China. And that is a result of a trade deal trying to get this system to be more reflective of the reality. I found that fascinating, actually. But it actually goes further than that. You actually have more countries than that in your garment. And here's why. We're going to move on now to the environment. So cotton is grown around the world. Half the countries in the world grow cotton. Of course, the U.S. is a huge grower of cotton. It's, in fact, the best-selling fiber in the world. In the U.S., it outsells all synthetic fibers combined. And it gets about 3% of the world's global agricultural land. So it also takes about a quarter of the world's insecticides and about 10% of the world's pesticides. So when a company like Gap or Walmart, one of the big ones, right, H&M, Sears even, when they put in an order for, say, 100,000 pairs of jeans, there's no one country in the world that can supply that much cotton, right? So what they do is buy cotton from a whole bunch of different countries and weave it together. So they might be buying cotton from Mali and Uzbekistan, Pakistan, and a little bit from the U.S. Actually, they probably wouldn't do it that way because geographically it doesn't make sense, but those were the countries I saw right away. So they'll buy cotton from 3 or 4 different countries, weave it all together so that there's a consistency in the pattern. So even before that garment is sewn, you have 3 or 4, maybe 5 countries represented in that one industry. If any of you read the book, you'll know that I spent a day picking cotton on the Iranian border. You could do that research with me too. That would be fun. This was, by the way, this was before the age of the iPad, which has made a reporter's job much easier. So I was out there picking cotton, and the cotton worker that I spoke to, who is this woman on the left, Ganira. Yes, your left. She's 32 years old, incidentally. She said to me, "Oh, sure, I'll talk to you all day, but you have to carry my bag for me." And this seemed like a good deal in the beginning of the day. So I tied it around my waist, and I had my camera in my back pocket. A lot of times I do what are called visual notes if I don't have time to write down everything that's going on, or the setting. I take pictures of it. And then I have my notebook, and then I have my recorder underneath my notebook, and then I got my pen, and I've got this cotton bag. And as I'm walking along, right, by noon, I realized I'd made a grave and tactical error in agreeing to carry her bag for her. But anyway, so I'm trying to pick cotton. She's telling me I'm slow. I'm telling her I'm actually trying to interview her at the same time. It was fun. They believed, incidentally, that they were growing organic cotton. This is in Azerbaijan, on the Iranian border. They were not growing organic cotton. I could look at that cotton and see that it wasn't organic. You could feel it. It had a film about it, right? It was full of chemicals. But all these workers believed. They'd been told they were growing organic cotton, and they believed it. This is a sad slide. This is just the U.S. 72 million birds a year are killed by pesticides. And of course, the orphan chicks. The average pair of jeans carries 3/4 of a pound of chemicals. I wrote this book a while ago, and I reread it about 1.5 years ago in preparation for a talk I was giving, and I came across this statistic which I had forgotten that I had once known, and I was like shocked anew. I thought, good Lord, that's a lot of chemicals. Cotton is incredibly tricky to grow. It requires a lot of sunlight, a lot of water. Where do we grow cotton in America? Yeah, in the desert. Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense that that's where we grow it. Well, the sunlight part makes sense. The water part does not make sense. There is a statistic I came across, I kid you not, that talks about how many American pairs of jeans you can get out of a bale of cotton versus European or Asian. can't remember what the statistic is, but it's literally like in Asia you can get like 500 pairs of jeans. In America you get 325, and in Europe you get 420 or something. I love it. It's great. So the medical community in the United States reports that there are somewhere between 10 and 20,000 poisonings a year of agricultural workers. This is all agriculture, not just cotton. But again, those are only the ones that are reported, right? Lots and lots of undocumented workers who get chemical poisonings are not going to be reported by the medical community because they'll never seek medical help, right? Most of the cotton grown in the U.S., in fact, all of the cotton grown in the U.S. apart from organic cotton, is GMO cotton with an insecticide built into the seed, right? So you get the boll weevils. To try to eliminate them, you build the insecticide into the seed. Now, of course, the boll weevils are overpowering that, so we have to come up with ever more powerful insecticide. Man against nature. In 2006, the EPA completed what was a 10-year study of pesticides, and they banned this many. So I'm going to run through just a couple of these really quickly here. This one, for example, malathion, is not banned. It's linked to cancer, fertility problems, neurological disorders. Here are 4 that were developed in World War I as toxic nerve agents. None of these are outlawed by the EPA. And this first one, more than 70% of all the carb exports were destined for developing countries. Now, how many people do you think read English labels for chemicals in developing countries? Probably not very many. Here's something I came across that described the personal protective equipment required for somebody using aldicarb, for a worker using aldicarb. Now, let me just tell you, in Cambodia, for example, where I lived, the construction workers wore flip-flops to work. Everybody wore flip-flops. It's a hot country, right? So keep that in mind as I read the personal protective equipment required for just this one chemical. Coveralls over short-sleeve shirt and short pants, waterproof gloves, chemical-resistant footwear plus socks, protective eyewear, chemical-resistant apron when cleaning equipment, mixing, or loading, approved respirator. Do you think these countries where people wear flip-flops on construction sites have any of this stuff? That's a rhetorical question. This last one is extremely hazardous. It's banned in 19 countries, and another 43 countries around the world make the importation of it illegal. The U.S. and China are not among those. So here's one possibility, organic cotton. You're like, oh, you're going to tell me something bad about organic cotton. I am going to tell you something bad about organic cotton. But I'm also going to tell you a couple of good things. So about 1% of the cotton grown annually around the world is organic, but the market demand increases by more than 30% every year, so that's a good sign. Part of the problem with cotton is that the yields are smaller. Controlling weeds and bugs is a significant problem that, of course, is normally handled by chemicals, and so there's more labor involved. It's more expensive to grow. It gets a lot more pest infestations. So in fact, organic cotton tends to be a lower quality than conventional cotton. This surprises a lot of people. It also uses more water and more land than conventional cotton. Part of the reason is that one of the things they do with organic cotton is called integrated pest management, where they plant a cotton field and then they plant a whole bunch of other types of agriculture around it that will compel the bugs away from the cotton and onto these other fields. And so it simply requires more land to do that. It's an imperfect solution. This is also one of the reasons why organic is a bit of a feel-good policy. These are jeans that have been treated in a laundry, right? They got that kind of funky vintage look about them. These are warp-dyed in an indigo bath somewhere between 3 and a dozen times. So you get these massive sheets of fabric that go up a conveyor belt, back down, they get dipped into a giant bathtub maybe about 2/3 the size of this stage. And then they go up again and down again and up again. And the number of times they get dipped will dictate how dark how dark they are. So anywhere between 3 and a dozen for an indigo dye bath. So huge amounts of water are needed for this. The problem, because there's always a problem, the problem is that this stage, to do any treatment on these jeans or any of your clothes, finishing, affixing the dye to fabric, chemicals are used in every stage, right? So it doesn't really matter if they're organic. In fact, more than 40,000 chemicals are used in the processing of textiles globally around the world. Not all of them are bad. It's important to keep that in mind, right? Not all of them are bad. But what happens is you have, for example, decolorization, which takes the blue haze out of water, but it doesn't take the chemicals out of water. Or to get those funky vintage looks that we saw, they use sulfur dyes. To get black jeans, they use sulfur dyes. We currently do not have a technology in the world that takes sulfur out of wastewater. So you're out there in another country, some developing country, and they're treating all these pants in a laundry, and they're just dumping the sulfur dye right back into that village system. I talked to one chemist who had gone to a factory during the day and seen that their wastewater treatment centers were all up and running and doing what they were supposed to be doing. And he went back at night, and the factory was still operating and had turned off essentially all of their wastewater treatment plants. So they were just simply dumping the water back into the source. And this is water where, of course, kids play in the water, people bathe in the water, they wash their clothes in the water. So sulfur dyes remain even after treatment. This is a big laundry that I was in. This is where they put those kind of, treatments and fix those things onto our various clothes. This is in Los Angeles. So the worst factory I was in all of my travels was LA, I have to say. It was the darkest. It had the worst ventilation. So you get that American Apparel guy who says, made in the USA. That is absolutely meaningless to me. There's no guarantee that we're doing much better in this country. This is one of my favorite slides because it's filled with irony. We like to think that what we're buying is unique, right? Until we see something like this that says, no, even your defects must be uniform and have certain quality. The guy that was showing me around this factory did not get the irony of that moment at all. I was laughing. I was doubled over laughing. I got to take a picture of that. And he was like stone-faced. This is that same factory preparing Levi's jeans for treatment. Anytime we have any kind of technology with our clothing, like Gore-Tex or, waterproof, but that's all from chemicals. Anytime you have that sort of permanent crease in your jeans, right, which comes from a resin that they put in one of these laundries, that's a chemical that allows that to happen. So the European Chemicals Agency a few years ago passed this 1,000-page law that they called REACH. And essentially it requires all businesses who are producing or selling products in Europe to prove that they've used safe chemicals in their production. And they've created a SIN list, what they call a SIN list, which is regularly updated and includes chemicals that shouldn't be used, that are highly toxic. The U.S., perhaps unsurprisingly, opposes this law. And the reason I was given was that environmental policies are driven by state, local, and federal offices, and the task of standardizing them is too complicated. So, okay, we're going to wrap up a little bit with a discussion of our role in all of this. That Bangladesh factory that collapsed, I was actually speaking at a college in Illinois the week that happened. I was speaking about this very issue. And I don't know how well you remember it, but the owner of that factory knew that there were infrastructure problems, right? And the media in this country, everybody was very quick to castigate him, right? We easily found a villain there. Well, it's the factory owner. He should have shut down, and he should have fixed the infrastructure problems of that factory and then reopened. Well, let me tell you what it would have been like from his point of view. When, I keep using the Gap, I don't mean it, they're actually one of the good ones. I should think of somebody else. When Sears comes and says, we want 100,000 blue Oxford shirts, they go to their agent in Singapore or Hong Kong, and they say, this is what we want it for the fall season. And that agent goes out to 30 factories and gets bids and says, Sears wants 100,000 blue shirts. How many can you do and by when? And those 30 factories all send back their bids. We can do 10,000 of them in 6 weeks. We can do 20,000 of them in 3 months, okay? And so about 5 factories will get chosen for a 100,000 unit order. So out of those 35 may get chosen, and all these brands use all the same factories interchangeably. I mean, they all have their own monitoring and whatever, and that's an issue as well. But so when a factory says, okay, I can have you 20,000 shirts in 2 months, and they find out that they have an infrastructure problem, what happens? Well, they're either going to be late with that order, right? Or because they've shut down their factory to fix their infrastructure problems, or they're going to try to complete that order and then maybe deal with the infrastructure problems. We don't know. Maybe not. Or they're going to lose the order from Sears, right? Because they'll be late, and Sears will say, hey, there were 25 other factories that bid on this. We could have gone with anybody. We're not going to go with you again because you can't get us your stuff in time, right? At the same time, who is making demands on Sears for new products all the time? Yeah. Who believes, by the way, that there are 4 seasons in clothing? You know, when I grew up, and probably this is true of some of you as well, there were 2 seasons. There was the school year, and there was summer. And that was it. And you got your new, clothes for the school year, and then you probably got something again at the end of the year, and that was it. Now we are living in an age in which we're told there are 4 seasons, and by the time those of you who are in college are my age and you have kids, there's going to be 6 seasons because that's where they're moving. Who's making those demands? We're being told that our clothing is disposable, right? That we have to buy things new every season. My God, when an actress in Hollywood wears the same dress twice, it's front page news. Are you kidding me? She can't wear the same dress twice? That's insane. So that factory in Bangladesh shares, I think, the fault collectively with a whole bunch of different pressures. And I think to lay the blame entirely at his feet, that factory owner's feet, and he's not without blame, but to lay the blame at his feet, I think, is to misread the problem or misunderstand the complexity of the world that we have sort of created. However, there's a silver lining, all right? This is actually, I'm going to leave you with a silver lining, I swear to God. So there are some things happening in the industry that I think are changing it. One of them is this guy who, the very first time I talked to him, this is what he said to me. This is one of my favorite quotes.
We know nothing about everything. It drives me crazy.
We know nothing about everything. It drives me crazy. This is Robin Cornelius. He has a brand in Switzerland called Switcher. He's going to describe what they're doing.
I said, Gilles, how can we communicate this on the label? And he said, we produce a code, link to a website, and then you feed the website with information, and then anybody reading that code is sent to the website. I said, this is brilliant, Gilles, let's do that.
So his accent's a little hard to hear, but what he's describing is what they call a DNA label. And so Switcher is available all over Europe now, and they're hoping to come to the U.S. in the next year or 2. So what he's talking about is a code that's on the tag when you buy a garment that you take back home. You can put it into your computer, and you can actually see where the cotton was grown, where it was woven into cloth and dyed, where it was assembled, and where it was shipped from. And they're doing that all over. In fact, I came to know about him and his project because Gap is considering doing this very thing. When I started researching my book in 2005, not a single brand would talk to me about what factories. They would tell me where they did garment manufacturing, but they wouldn't ever tell me what factories they worked in. Now, all those factories are on their websites. You can get all that stuff from the big ones. And it's not, incidentally, the Gaps of the world I'm worried about, or the Levi's of the world. Those are not the ones who are, they're under the media spotlight all the time. The ones I'm worried about are the Family Dollars, the Sears, right? The ones that nobody's really looking at. We're going to get back to Dan in just a second because he offers a solution, and I know that you want to know what his solution is. In addition to the DNA labels, though, there are other exciting things going on. Patagonia, for example, has all of their clothing recycled. It's all made from recycled material. Hermes, do you know the fashion brand Hermes? Have you heard of this one? Last year they started a slow fashion campaign that's built on the slow food campaign. It's essentially the idea is that your fashion is not disposable, that something you buy should last you 10 years. So you might pay $200 for it, but in the long run it's much, much cheaper because you won't be buying new ones every year. There's a clothes swapping initiative that started on UK campuses and is now moving over to the US called Swishing. I totally think you should do it here. Have swishing parties, clothes swapping parties. It's a great idea. There's another great one. A woman did something called the Uniform Project where she wore the same black dress every day for 365 days. And I swear to God, you go on her website, I think it's uniformproject.org, something like that. And it looks like she's wearing a different outfit. I want her to come and help me. This is amazing to see this. Target and Walmart are regularly using organics in their line. And the other thing we have to think about, people always ask me where they should shop. And I always say to them, it's not where you should shop. It's whether or not you should shop, right? Do you need that? Do we need 4 seasons of disposable clothing? And then also, what do you do after you own those clothes? Do you wear them once and wash them? I lived for 6 years in Cambodia without hot water in any of my, I had it in my shower. That was the only place I had it. 6 years. My dishes didn't get washed in hot water. My clothes didn't get washed in hot water. And I, you may have noted, am still alive. So we do not need hot water. We do not need to wash everything quite as much as we wash it. In fact, when I did this book, I hung around with Bono's designers, and it was like a badge of honor for them that they did not wash their jeans. Ever. They did not wash them. They just hung them out to air them out, and then they put them back on. And their theory was that the denim would, hug itself to you and form to your body specifically. And yeah, that's probably a little extreme even for me. But and so I'm going to wrap up today with Dan's solution, because even those Cambodian women have a reason to hope. So here is Dan Henkel from Gap Inc.
I'm going to use just another example. Let's say that there's a finding that a factory has been employing an underage worker. Typically, remediation would look like the worker can't be employed, but the factory basically pays for the worker's education, and then perhaps offers a job to that worker when they become of legal age. I mean, that would be a remediation plan. I think you'd want to look at something like that in this situation. Is there an opportunity, perhaps, to invest in job skills programs for the women in this particular prison so that they're ready to actually be competitive in the job market when they get out of prison? Is it possible to work with factory to say when the women do get released from prison, you should look at hiring them into your workforce?
So that's Dan's solution, remediation. In fact, it's used all over the world. Levi's has a wonderful story of remediation. Back in the late 80s, they found a whole slew of underage workers in one of their factories in Bangladesh. This is before the sweatshops were outed, right, in the mid-'90s, before we really knew. Kathy Lee Gifford had just happened. Well, you probably don't remember that, most of you in this room. But anyway, so they found something like 15 or 18 underage girls in this one factory. And instead of firing the girls and making the factory lose their contract, what they did was they said to the factory, okay, you have to agree to hold a place for these girls after their education is done, okay, to hire them back to the factory. We will pay the families their salary, and you, the factory, have to pay for their education. And the factory did. And all those girls got educated. And do you know, 5 of those girls went on to college. A couple of them came back and worked at the factory, but not many, actually, which is a great story. So this is Dan's solution, remediation. You give them training while they're in the prison. You make the factory give them a job for when they come out. So, thank you very much. I think we have time for questions, right? If anyone has any questions. Yeah, in the back. Yes, you're right. There's behind every line, there's like angst and gray hairs appearing, yeah. So it took me over a year just to get Gap to agree to let me go to their factory in China. And this was, by the way, one of their model factories run by a guy who graduated from the Wharton School of Business, right, in Philadelphia. A year. And then they said, they wanted me to sign something that said, you will not use any identifying details about this factory. You will not use the name. You will change everybody's names. And I said, I can't sign that, but I can agree to not use any identifying details. And by this time, I had been working with Dan Henkel. I'd interviewed him a number of times, and he finally sort of pushed it through. And by the time I got to that factory and saw what they had done, it was an amazing factory. I said to them, why would you not want your name used? Why would you not want your details used? And they came around and they let me use all of that. So everything that's in the book is legit. Sometimes it's literally, in this age of Facebook and technological communication, it's literally letting someone see your face, letting someone see your authenticity. Again, it's just time. It's time. I can't, I'm not a newspaper journalist. I'm a book and magazine journalist, and so I have the luxury of time. I'm doing a story right now for the New York Times Magazine on familicide, which is when someone kills their entire family. I'm trying to convince this guy in prison to let me interview him, right? So far it's been 5 months of letter writing back and forth, handwritten letters. It just takes time. The person who gets in is the person who doesn't allow no to be the answer, right? It's, again, that 14-year thing with the New Yorker. The cotton fields was actually relatively easy. I went first to the World Bank in Azerbaijan, and then they connected me to some cotton gin owners, and those cotton gin owners connected me to cotton field, farmers. So a lot of times it's just, who does this person know? Who else can I talk to? And a simple little thing to say is you finish every interview with who else can I talk to? That's true, by the way, if you go on informational interviews for jobs. Those of you who are graduating, right? You want to go work in an industry and there's no jobs in that industry, so you go and you do an informational interview. Never leave without saying, who else can I talk to? Keep that chain going. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, so Dan Henkel has a counterpart at Levi's named Michael Kabori, and Michael Kabori, who does this, I don't think he's there anymore. Actually, I'm not sure, but he had a background as an NGO worker, as an aid worker, and so Levi's hired him to do their sustainability, their making sure they had their factory monitors all set, and same with Dan Henkel as well. Neither one of them sort of came through the corporate chain. And there is a consortium called Business for Social Responsibility. I'm sure you've heard of it, and they're all part of it. But these brands play a huge role because they're the ones who have the economic power. And I think even the Gap, the Gap is sort of held up as a leader. I had Bono's designers say to me, if Gap has been in a factory, we don't bother monitoring because we know it's a good factory. Right, and that's great, but the truth is they have 50,000 factories around the world. I mean, they've got 400 in Cambodia alone, and they've got 80 factory auditors, 80 globally. So there's just no way to get through that kind of a system without infractions somewhere along the way. My experience was that the people who worked in this industry were up against cultural differences, economic hardships, local laws. For example, in China, when I was being taken around there, they said to me, the Wharton guy said to me, Gap allows 60 hours a week of work. You can have 20 hours a week of overtime. That is a very American thing, to work 60 hours a week, right? Like, we don't really think that's excessive. And he said, our local law in China is that we are only allowed to work 50 hours a week. That's our overtime that we're allowed legally. So whose law do you follow, right? So these are some of the things that they have to work out, sort of country by country, prefect by prefect, brand by brand. So I don't know if that answers your question, but any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, I touch on that very, very briefly in the book. Indigo is the classic one. I mean, it's been around since. In fact, in the book, I came across an early, I'm glad the president left, actually, an early recipe for dyeing indigo, which involves human urine. It's in the book. It's fantastic. I actually have a picture of it. So, any of those dyes are good alternatives, but they don't. First of all, if you want to make them color fast, right, not run, you have to use a chemical to affix it, so it doesn't matter how natural your dye is. The other thing is using natural indigo, which they do in Morocco, for example, just you don't get dark indigo. You'll end up with something fairly light. It just doesn't, you can't make it as dark as like the picture of those jeans that I showed you. So, they're a decent alternative, but they're artisanal, I think, and I think the mass market would be unhappy with the final product. All right, well, I have had a great time here today. I'm so thankful for all of you for sitting through that. I think you have an amazing community, and this is just such a fantastic event, and I really thank you for inviting me.